everybody. Welcome to part three of our Manifest Destiny series here. Today we're going to go over the Mexican War. So before we get started, I think there's a few questions that we should handle about the Mexican War. Okay, so the first question is, most Americans have no awareness that we actually, in our past, fought a war against Mexico. So if you go through our list of American wars, right? We fight for our independence, right? The American Revolution. That war starts in 1775 and ends in 1783. And then the first war, where, like, as a country that we actually declare war, is the War of 1812. So we declared war against Britain in 1812, and we signed the peace treaty in the very beginning of 1815. And if you remember, the War of 1812, another kind of forgotten war. And then the United States declared war against Mexico in 1846, and the peace treaty is signed in 1848, right? Following the Mexican War, the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, is fought in the 1860s. So those are the first four wars in American history, right? American Revolution, right? Fighting for our independence. Then kind of a rematch against Britain, War of 1812. Then we fight a war against Mexico in the 1840s. And then we fight the Civil War in the 1860s. So I think that's kind of a nice little introductory timeline. Okay, so I think the next question we have to address about the Mexican War is, why isn't the Mexican War talked about more? How come this isn't a war that's openly celebrated and acknowledged in American history? So there's a few reasons for that. Number one, the Mexican War would be described as a very imperialistic war. And what I mean by that is the reason why the United States declared war against Mexico in the 1840s is that Mexico had land that the United States wanted. So we fought Mexico and took it, right? I think that whenever you're fighting not for the defense of your country, but for offensive purposes, there's kind of a negative connotation attached to that. Now, not necessarily, right? The land that we won in the Mexican War became essential U.S. territory. But looking back in history, America often likes to think of a country that stands for freedom and defense and protecting what we believe in. The Mexican War kind of goes against that humble, defending yourself. We were the aggressors in this war. Definitively. We started this war against Mexico. I think another aspect that maybe makes this war a little bit negative is the president at the time, James K. Polk. He was a little bit untruthful to the American public when Polk explained to the people of the country why we were fighting. This was an offensive war. We were fighting for territory, but what Polk did as president is he kind of spun the information in a little bit of a different way that made it seem like we were fighting a defensive war. And then last but not least, because of the Mexican War and because of the expansion of the United States as a result of the Mexican War, we end up fighting the Civil War in the 1860s. So basically, if we look at like the causes of the American Civil War in the 1860s, if we view like a bunch of dominoes falling that eventually caused the war, you could kind of trace the beginning of the American Civil War to the land that we won in the Mexican War and not knowing whether that new land in the 1840s should be slave territory or free territory. So with that being said, let's move on. Okay, everybody, so let's go through the major events that led up to the United States declaring war on Mexico in 1846. So in 1845, when the United States officially annexed Texas and made Texas a state, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. Because remember, following that Texas Revolution, right, the Texas Army defeated Santa Anna, right, the military dictator of Mexico, at a battle called the Battle of San Jacinto. The Texans literally put a gun to Santa Anna's head and basically said, we are going to kill you unless you grant Texas its independence. So Santa Anna signed away Texas independence, and Texas, the Americans in Texas considered themselves to be an independent country. Now, immediately, the Texans wanted to become a part of the United States, but that didn't happen. The Texans were rejected. So for the span of 9 years, Texas was, they called themselves the Lone Star Republic, right? They were an independent country kind of on their own. But the problem with that was that the rest of the government of Mexico, besides Santa Anna, never acknowledged that Texas was an independent country. So in 1845, when Texas officially enters the United States, Mexico says to the United States, we're not talking to you. Like, we're on bad terms. You stole some of our land, right? So already the relations between the United States and Mexico are getting icy starting in 1845. So the second thing was that nobody was really sure, whether you're talking about from the Mexico perspective or from the American perspective, what were the boundaries of Texas. So if you look at a map of Texas today, the bottom border of Texas is a very well-known river, the Rio Grande, or the Rio Grande, right? But at the time, Mexico claimed that actually a different river was the southern border of Texas. So in a minute, I'll show you a map to make that clearer. So we'll get back to that topic in a little bit. The president, James K. Polk, upon having this little diplomatic tiff, and at this time, Polk is a new president, so he kind of senses that something's going to go down here. Polk sends a general by the name of Zachary Taylor with a group of troops into Texas, anticipating that there's going to be some kind of military action going on there. At the same time, James K. Polk sends a diplomat, like somebody who's employed by the U.S. government to make deals with foreign countries. So Polk sends a diplomat by the name of John Slidell to Mexico City. And Polk, when he runs for president, makes the promise, I'm going to bring California into the United States. So what Polk tries to do is he tries to get California the easy way. So he tells Slidell, offer Mexico a cash deal for, California. So basically Slidell makes a very fair offer. It's somewhere in the ballpark of between $20 and $30 million. Here, as the United States representative, we will buy California for market price. The problem was that in Mexico at the time, Mexicans were really anti-America. All that anti-Texas stuff and that Texan War for Independence. Public opinion was very much against selling any land to the United States, so the Mexican government refused to sell. Soon after that, James K. Polk tells his general there in Texas to go all the way up to the Rio Grande River, right? So what happens is we reach a point where the U.S. Army is on one side of the Rio Grande River, and the Mexican Army, they send troops and station their troops on the other side of the Rio Grande River. So there's basically like a standoff between the two countries. So now you have to look at this from the Mexican perspective. The Mexicans considered the Rio Grande River to be Mexican territory. So they basically assume that U.S. soldiers are stationing themselves on Mexican territory. The Mexican Army views our presence there as an invasion. So what happened was a small group of Mexican troops decided to cross the Rio Grande River, and when they did, U.S. soldiers opened fire on those Mexican soldiers, right? So now James K. Polk had all the ammunition he needed to declare war against Mexico. So James K. Polk goes to the U.S. Congress, claims that blood has been shed on U.S. soil, and the Senate and the House of Representatives overwhelmingly vote in favor of going to war with Mexico. The only problem with that claim by Polk was that there was really no proof that that land where those Americans were killed was American soil. It would have been more accurate to say that that area across from the Rio Grande, on the Rio Grande River, across from the Mexican soldiers, was really disputed territory. Here's a map of that kind of disputed territory that we discussed on the last slide. So if you look at the bottom of this map here, right, this is your Rio Grande River, right? So according to the United States, this area here was U.S. territory, right? Problem was that if you ask the Mexican government, what is the bottom border of Texas? The Mexican government said, no, it's not the Rio Grande, it's this Nueces River, right? So Mexico's saying this is the bottom border of Texas, and America is saying that this is the bottom border of Texas. So basically, this land in the middle, right? So I'll mark it up, right? This land here in the middle, we would describe that as disputed territory. America said it was theirs. Mexico said it was theirs. So basically, the 11 Americans that were killed in that Mexican attack, they were killed in this disputed territory. So obviously, when you're the president and you go to Congress and you go to the American people and claim that American citizens, American soldiers have been killed by a foreign country, it is a natural tendency among people to want to get revenge. And you want to have this like emotional moment where you say, we're going to go get those bastards. We're going to go fight them, right? And this is a pattern that has repeated itself many times in American history. So if you're a president and you want to convince the public that war is a good idea, it's very hard to do that without pointing to another country killing your guys, your men, your soldiers, or your people, and like that desire for revenge against the country. All right. So let me just give you some other examples in American history of Americans being killed and that leading to war. So in the 1890s, America declares war on Spain, the Spanish-American War. And the big moment that leads America to declare war against Spain is the sinking of a U.S. ship called the Maine, right? So at the time, President McKinley says that Spain shot a torpedo at the Maine, sunk it, killed Americans, and we should go to war. And that's what happened. We ended up going to war against Spain. History later revealed that Spain did not sink the Maine, but Americans were still emotional following that event. World War II, I think, is the best example. So when the Japanese come and bomb Pearl Harbor, right, America up to that point had not entered World War II. Once the Japanese bomb World War II, Americans get emotional. They want to declare war against Japan and the Nazis and get revenge for Pearl Harbor, right? During the Vietnam War, there's an incident in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin. So there's a supposed attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, which ends up leading the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, to escalate our war in Vietnam, okay, when Americans were killed. And then lastly, I think the most recent example would be the war in Afghanistan. So following September 11th, Americans wanted revenge, for all those Americans who'd been killed. So in 2001, George W. Bush declared war on Afghanistan in order to invade the country, take a group called the Taliban out of power, and prevent terrorists from being trained in that territory. So it kind of starts with the Mexican War. Americans have been killed. We need to fight back. And we see that trend happen over and over again in American history, where if Americans are killed by a foreign enemy, then we declare war, and that war has overwhelming support. One part of this class that I've discussed numerous times as we've approached wars is that the AP U.S. history curriculum really honestly does not value military history very much. But because we are at home and because we are doing remote learning, and many of us have nothing better to do, all right, I'll maybe go into just a little bit of the military aspects of the Mexican War, just so you get a sense of like how and why the United States wins this war. Okay. So the best way I can describe the military aspect of the Mexican War is that the war takes place in 3 phases. And I'll try not to mark this up too much, but I'll just mark it up a little bit. The first phase of this war happens here, right? So this part here of Mexico, right? And the U.S. general who fights battles in this northern area of Mexico just south of the Rio Grande was this guy Zachary Taylor. So what happens is Zachary Taylor ends up winning a number of battles in this northern part of Mexico. The most famous battle initially is this battle called Monterrey. Right? I'll erase that because that's covering that up. That's not very smart. Let's try yellow. So this battle, Monterrey, kind of really increases Zachary Taylor's profile. And what happens is, at the time, James Polk realizes that because of Zachary Taylor's wins in battle, that Zachary Taylor's kind of becoming a huge hero in America. Like, Americans are really liking Taylor's wins in battle. So Polk is kind of a petty man, and the problem with Zachary Taylor was that Zachary Taylor was a Whig politically, and James K. Polk was a Democrat. So James K. Polk starts to get a little bit worried and says, if this guy Taylor becomes a hero, he's going to run for president against me, and he's going to win. So at this point in the first phase of the war, basically Polk says, all right, Zachary Taylor, you've done enough. You're not going to fight anymore. You're going to stop. And then we're going to segue to a different part of the war, right? Polk wants to take the attention away from one of his generals, Taylor, who's doing real well. The problem is, though, is that Taylor doesn't really listen to him. So Taylor ends up fighting another battle after he gets that instruction called the Battle of Buena Vista. And for all of you good South Jersey residents, you probably know that there's a little area very close to Hamilton called Buena Vista. Buena Vista is named after this battle from the Mexican War, except for we Americanized the pronunciation and turned it from Buena to Buna. Okay, so a little local history there for us. Buena Vista is a huge win for Zachary Taylor. It turns him into an even bigger hero. So at this point of the war, we move into phase 2. Okay. I'll put a little 2 there. Okay. So at this point, we have a new general who steps up as a leader in the war effort. And this general's name was Winfield Scott. Okay. At this time, it was pretty much acknowledged that Winfield Scott was the best general and the best military mind in the United States, taking nothing away from Zachary Taylor, but Winfield Scott was a veteran of the War of 1812. He had been known by the American public for a very long time. And what happens here is that Winfield Scott decides to take his troops from New Orleans on boats down to a city here called Veracruz. And what the Americans do is they launch an amphibious landing in the Mexican city of Veracruz. And then what happens is the U.S. soldiers go from Veracruz, right, and march all the way across Mexico here and capture Mexico City, right? So that amphibious landing and that march all the way to Mexico City and the battles that are fought along the way, that was so perfect militarily that that landing and that march to Mexico City is still studied in military schools today. Okay, so obviously Winfield Scott is a hero because of that as well. The third phase of the Mexican War takes place in California. So we'll put like a little number 3 here. And what happened was there were actually Hispanic residents of California who hated Mexico. And their main reason for hating Mexico was there were a lot of Native Americans in California, and Native Americans constantly attacked the Hispanic residents, and Mexico had no desire to help those Hispanic residents living in California. So when the American army marches into California during the Mexican War, the Mexican residents and the Mexican government of California, they basically surrender without a fight, and they say, please take us over, all right? So that bloodless revolt where the U.S. Army enters California, takes it over, and then they name California to be a part of America. I have up here in the notes, we call that the Bear Flag Revolt. So they raise a flag in California with a bear on it that kind of signifies that now California is an American territory. The two generals who are responsible for this aspect of the war, you see General Stephen Kearny, and then there's another general by the name of John Fremont. And those guys are U.S. generals who invade California and help take it over. Very quickly, here is a picture of the bear flag that was raised in this Bear Flag Revolt. This is a flag that you still see quite often. A few years ago, it was a fashion trend that this California flag was put on like t-shirts and things like that. So I'm sure that many of you have seen that flag before. So we know, looking back, that during the time that the Mexican War was being fought, the war was overwhelmingly popular with Americans. But anytime you fight a war, and especially when you feel like the president or politicians are being deceitful, or you're being lied to, right? This has happened a lot in American history. Americans have said that, well, you say that we're fighting the war for this reason, but it's really about something else, right? There were people who were very skeptical of Polk and the Mexican War. So I'm just going to go through a few of those people so you can get a sense of some of the anti-war protests at the time. So let's start off with Abraham Lincoln, right? In the 1840s, Abraham Lincoln was a first-term congressman from Illinois. We know Lincoln today as a great American hero, a president, but in the 1840s, Lincoln was not a very well-known guy. So Lincoln, during the Mexican War, was one of the only politicians in Congress to basically call James K. Polk a liar and a fraud. And this really gave Lincoln a negative reputation because, like I said, most Americans thought this war was a great thing. So I'm going to read to you what Lincoln's objection was. So his quote is, "The Mexican War is immoral, pro-slavery, and a threat to the country's Republican values." What Lincoln is saying here is basically that we're starting the war, right? We're the aggressors. We're fighting this war so that we can add more slave territory to the United States because James K. Polk is pro-slavery. And our Republican values, are usually like the idea that we fight for freedom and we stand for freedom. Lincoln's saying this war has nothing to do with freedom. And then Lincoln made the claim that James K. Polk said that American soldiers were killed on American soil. So Lincoln said, I want to see the exact location of where those soldiers were killed because I don't believe what you're saying. I don't believe that they were killed on American soil. So be aware that as a politician, one of the ways that you can make a name for yourself is by criticizing the president. So for example, if you're a Democrat right now and you want to increase your profile, you attack Donald Trump. And when Barack Obama was president and you were a Republican, one of the best ways to raise your profile politically was to bash Obama, all right, to get your party on your side. So at this time, Abraham Lincoln is a dedicated Whig politician. Polk is a Democrat. So Lincoln steps up and bashes the president who belongs to an opposite political party. Let's now move on to Henry David Thoreau. Okay, Henry David Thoreau was a transcendentalist writer. He hated war. He thought war was stupid. And he thought that this particular war against Mexico was wrong. So Henry David Thoreau came up with the idea that because this war was wrong, he did not want $1 of his tax money going to support this war against Mexico. So on purpose, Henry David Thoreau refused to pay a tax that would be used to support the military, right? So he knew that by not paying this tax, he would get thrown in jail. Henry David Thoreau wanted to go to jail and wanted to break the law in order to prove a point. So he goes to jail. He eventually gets bailed out by a wealthy family member. But this time in jail causes Henry David Thoreau to write a very famous essay called Civil Disobedience. So Thoreau's idea was that if a law is immoral, you should non-violently break the law, go to jail, and if enough people break the law and go to jail, the public will realize how wrong the law is. This essay by Henry David Thoreau, Civil Disobedience, circulates very widely and is read by a lot of very influential people. So, for example, in India, there was a man by the name of Mahatma Gandhi who was very frustrated with the British imperial presence in India and wanted the British people gone. So Gandhi's idea was to peacefully protest, break the British laws, and get rid of the British. That's what he does. More famously, in America, there's a man by the name of Martin Luther King, who in the 1960s intentionally gets his followers and himself to violate segregation laws. So Martin Luther King famously writes a letter from a Birmingham jail, right? Martin Luther King was influenced by the actions taken by Henry David Thoreau during the Mexican War. You break the law, you go to jail, and you prove to the American people that the government is unjust. And the term we use for that today is simply civil disobedience, breaking the law on purpose. Lastly, there is a soldier in the Mexican War who fights for the American side, Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant ends up becoming one of the most famous generals of the Civil War and goes on to be elected president. Grant's quote is this: "The Mexican War was one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. I have never altogether forgiven myself for going into that war." So as a soldier, you are taught to do what you are told. But in the aftermath of the war, Grant reflects on why this war was fought, and he openly admits that we were the bully. America fought a war against a weaker nation and took advantage of Mexico. Let's now talk about the end of the Mexican War. So the peace treaty that ends fighting is signed in 1848. The peace treaty has a rather interesting name. It's named after the little village outside of Mexico City where peace was signed, a place called Guadalupe Hidalgo. So the peace treaty is known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? But the more important thing I would say is to take a look at what America won as a result of the Mexican War. So this area here, right? I mean, if you take a look at what areas in the modern day United States we won in the Mexican War, it's some really important states, right? California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado. It's a lot of land. So that area that we won, which we refer to in history as the Mexican Cession, right? That was 33% of the entire land area of Mexico at the time. Okay, so that's nothing to laugh at. That's a significant chunk of land that we won from Mexico, right? And if you look here, it says that we paid Mexico $15 million. That was like our way of saying, like, sorry, Mexico, we took your land, but we want to give you something in return, okay? So we did pay Mexico a little bit, I guess, to get rid of our guilt. I don't know, right? If you move under that, right, it says the Mexican War was the first U.S. war fought on foreign soil. So these battles during this war, they were not fought in America. This war was entirely fought in Mexico. And I think it's worth acknowledging that this war was, I mean, it was really one-sided. We didn't lose, the Americans did not lose a single battle, right? So militarily, I mean, this war was very, very one-sided. So that claim that we were a bully, that we were taking advantage of a weaker country, I mean, it was kind of true. There were a few reasons why the U.S. dominated so much. The American Army had better cannon, artillery, and we had a Navy and Mexico didn't. So for those reasons, even though in several battles where we were outnumbered, Americans found a way to win every battle, okay? So if we take a look at how many U.S. soldiers were killed, 13,000 casualties here, and the mortality rate, the rate of people dying during the Mexican War, Americans at least, was very, very high, okay, for the number of troops that were engaged. And I think the important thing here to keep in mind is that the Mexican War has a direct effect on the coming of the Civil War in the 1860s, right? So because America expands so much in size so quickly, we had not figured out what the future of slavery was in America. So between 1848 and 1860, the biggest issue in American politics becomes, what are we going to do about the expansion of slavery? One little side note before we kind of end here today, and I think I do have one more slide really quick at the end, is that a lot of young men who graduated from West Point Military Academy end up fighting in the Mexican War. So on a previous slide, I had pictures of guys like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses Grant, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and I could go on for even longer. But what we see is that in Mexico, a lot of young American soldiers fight together as United States soldiers, as American brothers in arms. But what these men don't know is that 12 years later, all of these guys who went to West Point together and who fought in Mexico together are going to fight a civil war against each other. So when we learn about the Civil War is a very intimate affair in that the generals of the Union and the generals of the Confederacy are all friends, all went to school together, and all fought in Mexico together. So it's sort of like, playing sports against people who live in the same town as you, but you're on different teams. You know them all, you have a rapport with them, you might even like them, but during the game you're at war. And that's kind of what happens during the Civil War. This last slide is meant to be a review for you, especially considering that you have to write an essay on manifest destiny. So during the 1840s, what we're going to say is that the United States expanded in three ways. So let's start off in 1845. In 1845, the independent country of Texas was annexed and becomes a state in the United States. All right. So that happens kind of right before Polk takes over. The Congress approves the annexation once Polk is elected. So make sure you know that Texas was one of the ways that the United States expanded in the 1840s. If you go down to number 2, the United States ends up signing a treaty with the British to prevent a war over Oregon. So in 1846, the Oregon Treaty establishes the 49th parallel, I'll mark it up for you, as the border or the dividing line of the Oregon Territory. We agree, without fighting a war, that the top part is going to be British and the bottom part here is going to belong to the U.S. And that is the second way during the 1840s that the United States gets bigger. So we add a chunk of the Oregon country or the Oregon Territory. Lastly, in 1848, when basically the Americans end up winning the Mexican War, this territory, which once again we refer to as the Mexican Cession, C-E-S-S-I-O-N, the Mexican Cession, is added as a result of winning the Mexican War and paying the Mexican government $15 million. So when you do write this essay about the expansion of the United States, I think it would be worthwhile somewhere in the essay to show that you have good knowledge of how America expands, that Texas was added as a state, we signed a treaty to acquire a large piece of the Oregon country, and lastly, we won California and the surrounding areas in the Mexican War, referred to as the Mexican Cession. Really good job, guys. Thank you, and I'll see you for part 4 of our Manifest Destiny series.